How's it going, everybody? This is Jeremy with Commander Quantified here for yet another episode of Quantified Theory. Don't forget, if you want to support this content, like, subscribe, support me on Patreon, anything you can do to help, and I'll keep making these videos for you. So let's get right down to it. What exactly is single target removal? Removal generically can be like something that just takes a threat away from play, right? So this, though, is going to be a spell or ability that can remove individual targets from play at least 1 degree. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? What I mean is that there's kind of a progression that you can go through as far as like how accessible is this card to me. In play obviously means that it has been played, it's affecting the current state of the game. So it is a creature that, or enchantment or artifact, planeswalker, or something that has hit the board, and it is able to do something actively. Or it's an instant or sorcery that is currently going off, it's doing its effect, and it's going to move you closer to winning the game. So if you're going to separate that threat from the game at least 1 degree, what does that look like? So here are some examples of what I would say degrees are. I would say that moving something back to a person's hand is like half a degree, because they do have to play it over again, but they still have access to it immediately. They don't have to like go through the process of finding another card to get it back or something like that. The graveyard would be separating it from play at least 1 degree because you have to have some form of recursion in order to get it back. In the same way, a library would be 2 degrees, right? Because you have to tutor it in order to play it. So you have to first find your tutor, which is 1 degree, and then you have to actually find the card, which is the 2nd degree. Exile, I would say, is 3+ degrees, really, because it's extraordinarily hard to get something back from exile. There are very few things that do that. Ingest is an old, I believe it is from the Oath of the Gatewatch set, that you can basically take a card from exile and put it back in somebody's graveyard to get some sort of bonus effect. But that's about the only way, aside from like 1 card that returns a face-up exiled card back to your hand, or like wish cards or something like that. So yeah, exile is probably the best because it separates it from play the most. So when we're quantifying removal, what we're looking for is how many degrees from play does this separate this card from play. Alright, so moving into actually quantifying removal, right? We talk about how many degrees removed, which we just talked about a little bit and we'll talk about again in a second. So how many steps does it take to play the card again? Your efficiency, so how much mana does, or other costs does the spell involve to get rid of something. The versatility, so how many types of things can it remove. There are 7 total types of cards in Magic. How many of those does it do? So that's just a fraction, right? What are the number of targets? So single target removal is anything that basically can hit a chosen card. So if that's the case, it can hit multiple targets. That's still considered single target removal. Points of interaction, how many points on the degree chart can the spell interact? I would also say whether it's an instant or sorcery card kind of goes with points of interaction, because a sorcery card you can only do it on your turn, instants you can do on anybody's turn. So, and then we'll move forward, additional costs, so that's kind of like the efficiency portion, but it's a little bit of an extra added layer. There are a lot of those when it comes to developing this metric, because you can take single target removal and divide it down into, okay, well, how many things does it remove? Like how many opportunities do you have to play it? What's the mana cost? You know, and it actually like it layers down quite a bit if you're going to actually quantify removal into a number. So the additional cost doesn't give a player anything in return. Do you have to pay something extra? So let's give some specific examples of degrees of removal, because we just talked about that a minute ago. How far from play does this get removed? So here are 5 examples, and we'll just go through them one by one. Chaos Warp is one that I have more recently come to enjoy, as far as like it separates it from play quite a bit more than other cards. It is an instant for 2 and a red. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. There is a more recent printing of this. I'm not sure the name of it, but it came in one of the pre-cons from Streets of New Capenna. So this card in particular, it puts it back into the library. They do have a chance to hit it again, but if you are doing just literal 1-for-1 odds, you're talking they have a 1 in probably like 83 chance to hit the same thing again. That's not great odds. And then they have to find it if they want to play it again. So if you're talking about like removal of permanent, that goes to library. So that would be considered one of those 2-degree removal spells. Remand, which is a 1 in a blue instant, counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, put it into its owner's hand instead of into that player's graveyard. Draw a card. So this would be considered a 1/2 degree removal because the player still has access to that card and has the ability to play it. You've kind of just delayed the inevitable, same kind of similarity with like an unsummon, which we'll talk about later. Doomblade, which is a 1 and a black instant, destroy target non-black creature. So this moves the creature zones, right? It moves it from play to the graveyard, which is 1 step harder to get to. So this is a pretty classic card. Literally, there are jokes that have gone around forever about dies to Doomblade, and I mean that's most anything that's not a black creature, right? So this removes it 1 degree. Scavenging Ooze would be removal, but it's removal for the graveyard, right? So it's 1 and a green creature ooze. It's a 2/2. You can pay a green and exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze, and you gain 1 life. So this takes it from the graveyard to exile, so it removes it 1 more step, basically. Or 2 more steps if you are doing the 3 as the exile quantity. The last one we're going to look at is Syncopate. It is a instant for X and a blue. Counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So this moves it from the stack to exile. So that's actually a very good card. The fact that they have to pay X means it's kind of modular. So if somebody has exactly 7 mana and is trying to Cyclonic Rift, you're going to exile it for 2 mana, which is pretty great. Again, casual pods works really well. Anything that's kind of below a 4 on the 1 to 5 power level. So that would be a good recommendation, is like Dissipate, Syncopate. Those are great cards to be running. So next up we're going to be talking about Versatility. And Versatility is pretty simple. It's how many card types can it remove. If you're looking at something like Naturalize, which is an instant for 1 and a green, destroy target artifact or enchantment, it can remove 2 different types of cards out of 7, so it scores accordingly. Bedevil is a instant for black, red, destroy target artifact, creature, or planeswalker, so that has 3 out of 7, so scores accordingly. And then Anguish Unmaking is 1 white, black, instant speed, exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life, so that is going to be a 4 out of 7 because you have instant sorceries and lands that it can't hit out of the 7 different types of cards. The next thing we need to quantify is the number of targets. And so when we're looking at different cards like this, we'll start with Return to Dust, which is an old staple. I don't know that it's as good as it used to be, just because the sorcery speed has become somewhat stigmatized. It is an instant for 2 white, exile target artifact or enchantment. So exile, great, right? If you cast this spell during your main phase, you may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. So it hits 2 types and removes 2 of the artifact or enchantments. So that's a good example of that. Same kind of thing with Force of Vigor. It is an instant for 2 green. If it's not your turn, you may exile a green card from your hand rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Destroy up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments. So this one gets used all the time. It is an absolute powerhouse, but it is 2 targets, so that's something that you do have to consider when you're running stuff. If you think about it this way, even if you pay full retail for Force of Vigor, you're still naturalizing twice, which is a good rate. And then last we have Klauth's Will. It is X, red, red, green for an instant. Choose one. If you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both. Breathe Flame. Klauth's Will deals X damage to each creature without flying, or Smash Relics. Destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments. So the X, usually we're going to be evaluating X as though this were cast on turn 6. And that's kind of the same thing I did with Burst Draw, if you watched that episode, is that turn 6 is kind of a pivotal point when you are going to be like, okay, well, before this, I don't think I'm going to get any more profit out of it. Same thing with afterwards. So turn 6 is kind of the evaluator. And by then you should have ramped twice. So this can actually, up to 5 is how many this can do on turn 6. So that's a good example. Number of targets. Factor it in when you're doing stuff. Don't be afraid to run stuff that hits sorcery speed. I'd say Return to Dust is actually one of the better removal spells when it comes to degrees of removal in a more casual pod. Alright, so real quick, let's address points of interaction. You've kind of gotten an idea of this by now because we've actually talked about the different areas that you can remove it from play. So how many points can it remove the card from play? So if you're talking about like making something less accessible, that's what we're really looking for here. So let's do a practical application of this points of interaction thing. So at how many points can it remove? You've got library, hand, stack, from play, and from the graveyard. So let's just take a card and look at it. So Unnatural Aggression is 2 and a green for an instant. It has Devoid, so it doesn't have a color when it's on the stack. Target creature you control fights. Target creature an opponent controls. If the creature an opponent controls would die this turn, exile it instead. So this specifically removes a creature card from play, but it removes it 3 degrees, right? Because it goes all the way over to exile. So it's actually a pretty darn good card. Dissipate, we just talked about this a minute or two ago, so it's 1 blue for an instant counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. So this only interacts, as with almost all counter spells, on the stack. So you have to be really careful with how many counter spells you're running if you don't know your pod, or if your power levels are lower, because it's harder to predict which cards are going to be important. I'm kind of a proponent in our group of not running counter spells, but running like copies and redirects and stuff like that, because that does move the game forward rather than just noping somebody's stuff. Next we're going to have Bitter Ordeal for 2 and a black. It's a sorcery. Search target player's library for a card and remove that card from the game. That player shuffles his or her library. It does have Gravestorm. So when you play this card, for each permanent put into a graveyard from play this turn, you get to copy it and choose new targets for the copy. So basically this can remove a bunch of cards from somebody's library and moves them over into exile, which is really great. Again, if you're playing in a pod where you're more familiar, it's more powerful. I wouldn't run this unless you're in like a pretty like high power pod that you're like, okay, well, I'm sure that I can get rid of like X amount of win conditions from somebody's deck. If you're running Prosper, this gets ridiculous because of all the treasure tokens. Because you can sacrifice a bunch of permanents, and then you get to do this over and over again. You can probably get up to like 5 removal of win conditions from somebody's deck. So move on to Thoughtseize. This is more of a modern card, but I wanted to put it in here just because it bears repeating. So Thoughtseize is a single black for a sorcery. Target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. You lose 2 life. So this moves it from the hand to the graveyard, so it does separate 1 degree. can be useful. You can use it on yourself. Has been done, especially if you're like, oh, I really want to be able to play this gigantic monster next turn. So you can Thoughtseize yourself, put it in your graveyard, and then recur it if you have some sort of recursion spell. Last one we're going to talk about is Lion Sash, 1 and a white for an artifact, creature, equipment, cat. That's a little bit of a mouthful. Anyway, it's a single white to exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash and has reconfigure for 2, which is like equip unequip basically, and it turns into a creature when you unequip it. So this removes from a graveyard and moves it into exile. So that is another one that's like it's 2 degrees removed, but it's not dealing with something that's directly an issue. I would say that when you're running up against more powerful decks, that comes in handy. Lion Sash, Scavenging Ooze, those are the 2 that really do well at it. So let's talk about some additional costs when you're casting a spell. So some of the common ones, and I'll probably forget at least 1 or 2, but this is just an example, so bear with me here. Anguished Unmaking, we talked about a minute ago. It is an instant 1 white black, exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life. So the additional cost here is that you lose the life in order to do it. So that is an additional cost for this removal. Same thing with Snuff Out. But Snuff Out really only costs life most of the time, so it is an instant for 3 and a black. If you control a swamp, you may pay 4 life rather than pay Snuff Out's mana cost, so it's a replacement effect. Destroy target non-black creature, it can't be regenerated. So it Doomblades for 4 life instead, right? As long as you control a swamp. But the 4 life is an actual cost, it's 10% of your life total. This bears repeating over and over again. Use your life as a resource. This is a great card. Play it. Next we're going to talk about Swan Song. It is a single blue for an instant counter target enchantment, instant or sorcery spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 bird creature token with flying. So the additional cost here is that you give the controller a 2/2 bird. So that's kind of along the same line as the next card, Beast Within, so that's 2 and a green for an instant. Destroy target permanent. Pretty great. Its controller creates a 3/3 beast creature token. Not so great. Tokens are pretty easy to deal with, so this is kind of a moot point as far as a cost. If you are running up against a deck that likes having creatures, target somebody else with these. Because unless it's going to immediately lose you the game, you're better off giving it to someone who has a harder time utilizing that token. Next we're going to talk about Path to Exile. It is a single white for an instant exile target creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put that card into play tapped, and then shuffle. Yet again, one of those modern staples. Swords to Plowshares gains your opponent life, and that's kind of the perfect removal spell, quote unquote, for a creature, right? Because we were talking about life not really mattering, so paying life with Anguished Unmaking and Snuff Out. That probably isn't going to come into play as much in like higher powered pods, because most people are going to be winning by like a combo or just like complete overrun, and there's no way you could have done anything anyway. But this one gives a land. So in more casual pods, this is actually, it can have a big impact in the game, because ramping your opponent for the sake of a creature, what if they cast their commander 1 turn earlier, and that's what won them the game? That's a perfectly possible thing that could happen. Same kind of thing with Assassin's Trophy, which is an instant for a black-green, destroy target permanent. Great, completely unconditional. And opponent controls. Alright. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle their library. So same thing, go look at the basic land, put it on the battlefield. This one's not tapped, which can come into play eventually. You will find times when that is actually what is the problem. But long story short, what we're talking about here, there are some removal spells that have additional costs. I would say err toward the ones that give things that are useless or things that don't quite matter as much in your meta. So if you're gonna win by a combo, you don't care if you give somebody life. Play Swords to Plowshares. Just exiles a creature for a single white mana at instant speed, says that controller gains life equal to its power. So if you're running in more casual pods, things like Path to Exile Assassin's Trophy, not so great to be ramping your opponent. I don't think it's great to be ramping your opponent in general in a meta that goes 8 turns or more long, because that can enable some really crazy shenanigans. If you are ramping on turns 2 and 4 and somebody Assassin's Trophies something of yours, you are going to be at 7 mana early enough where you can have somebody cast a Cyclonic Rift, and you just gave them the extra mana to do that. And that's always a feel bad. So keep the extra costs in mind. Alright, so let's talk about some other quote-unquote removal, right? Some people really hate it when you do the quotation marks with your fingers, but deal with it. So this is cards that bounce to hand or temporarily exile. So I would say something that removes a card from play that temporarily, like you can get it back that quickly, is not as great. So Unsummon is an example of that. It's a single blue for an instant. Return target creature to its owner's hand. The player can play it again the next turn without a problem. You've probably generated some sort of mana advantage, so like you only paid 1, but they paid 5 or 6 for that creature. But still, it's not the best removal when for like 1 more you can actually exile it and just give them like a 2/2 or a 4/4. There are cards that do that in blue. Reality Shift is one of them. The other one is newer from Strixhaven. Flicker Wisp is a 1 white 3/1 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, exile another target permanent. Kind of cool. It's not conditional to creatures. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. If this had flash, it would be a monster card because you could stop somebody in the middle of a combo. That would be great. But it does not. So you are just really removing like a blocker, or somebody's ensnaring bridge so you can get through, or something of that nature. But it only does it for 1 turn and only when this enters the battlefield, so it's not really like removal, so to speak. Oblivion Ring is a removal spell. It's 2 and a white for an enchantment. When Oblivion Ring enters the battlefield, exile another target non-land permanent. When Oblivion Ring leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So this sits out there as a permanent on the field, and the removal is dependent on it staying there. So that it's really conditional. It is hard to keep these things on the field unless you are running. You're not likely running Oblivion Ring. I'm just going to put that out there. But if you're running Oblivion Ring in something like Enchantress, where you are casting enchantment spells and drawing cards, works really well. Usually you're going to have a way to protect your enchantments. If you don't, think about adding that to your deck. So you know my metric, you know how this works. So I use my 4 core measurements: utility, efficiency, synergy, and opportunity, to evaluate every single card that goes through when they release new sets. I think that it's extraordinarily efficient to do it that way. So I'm going to do it with these particular cards. I just kind of chose them, not so much randomly, but they are reasonable. Vraska's Contempt was a monster in standard, 2 black, instant, exile target creature, planeswalker, you gain 2 life. So as far as utility, gets a point, right? Efficiency, scores a 4, not great. Synergy is going to be if you have something that maybe is a life gain deck, this would score a synergy point because it does gain life. If you have something that profits off of exiled cards, this can actually be a synergy piece. As far as opportunity, you have 4 times the amount of opportunity to cast this because it's an instant speed, so 4 turns rather than just 1 if it was a sorcery. Next, we'll look at Thrashing Brontodon. It's a 1 green 3/4 creature dinosaur. This actually held a special place in my heart as a above curve, just great blocker, and you can just hold up 1 mana and threaten to destroy somebody's artifact or enchantment. That actually wins you a lot of political arguments if you are, hey, don't counter that, I'll get rid of your Soul Ring or something like that, and the person's already kind of screwed on mana. So for a colorless, you can sacrifice Thrashing Brontodon to destroy an artifact or enchantment. In the meantime, it's a 3/4. And 3 power creatures win games. You can quote me on that. Works really well. I'm an old-time Dredge player, prized amalgam wins. So Thrashing Brontodon utility, it is a creature, which is great. Just having a blocker is a great utility. It is also a removal spell if you need it to be. As far as efficiency, it scores pretty high on that because it's a 3-drop, 3/4 creature, which passes the vanilla test, if you've ever heard of that. That was popularized by limited resources, and I use it to evaluate pretty much every creature that comes out, and whether or not I buy it is very dependent on whether it passes the vanilla test. Synergy, let's say you're running a creature. Volo is a great example. So Volo, you can get 2 of these because it's a dinosaur, and you probably aren't running any other dinosaurs in your deck. If you are running a dinosaur tribal deck, and you can hit this off of, like, let's say Gishath Sun's Avatar, that would be a synergy piece. If you have a aristocrats deck like Corvold, this likes to sacrifice itself. So there you go. If you've got an aristocratsy prophet type build, this works really well too. And as far as opportunity, so you can only cast it on your turn, but you can detonate on everybody's turn. So I still give it 4 points on that. Next, we're going to talk about Pyroblast, which is an instant for a single red. Counter target spell if it's blue, destroy target permanent if it's blue. You can do one or the other. So as far as utility is concerned, this is a removal spell. It's a very efficient removal spell. It probably is not scoring any synergy points. And opportunity is at instant speed, so it does score high on that. So here's the deal, is that not only, it only hits 20%, probably less if you actually took the actual numbers off of like EDHREC or something like that to how many decks run how much blue, because that's really what it boils down to, right? Is like, if you're not playing against blue decks, running like Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast is actually really terrible. This comes from personal experience. I used to add a lot of those to like my mono red Teralf deck, which is great if you want to get around counter spells, but if you're not playing against any blue decks in that pod, these are completely useless. Run one or the other, don't run both. That's my advice, unless you're running against like a pod that has a bunch of blue in it. And last, we're going to talk about Amphin Mutineer. This is from Commander Legends. 3 and a blue creature, Salamander Pirate. It is a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-salamander creature. That creature's controller creates a 4/3 blue salamander warrior creature token. It has Encore for 4 blue, which basically means that you can exile from your graveyard, create a token for each opponent, and swing with it that turn. Then you have to sacrifice them at the end step. It's activate only as a sorcery. So, when we are talking about Amphin Mutineer, what it does for utility, right? It creates token. So it can create that on your side of the board, which is not necessarily bad. There are times when you're going to want to do that. But it is a removal spell, and it can remove 3 things when you're talking about it coming back for the Encore. So it has a lot of opportunity to create value for you. Efficiency, it's a 4-drop 3/3. I would say that's kind of meh. The Encore is really where it's at on this one, because you can remove 3 pretty core pieces potentially with it, doing the Encore. And for synergy, you're probably running this in like a Pirates deck or something like that, so that it profits off of like your Admiral Beckett Brass gives +1/+1 to all your Pirates or something like that. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other significant synergy pieces. As far as opportunity is concerned, this only scores a 1 because it can only happen on your turn. Even the Encore is only as a sorcery. Alright, so some takeaways from all of this. What does the best removal have? Well, the best removal has low mana cost and low additional costs, right? Has many kinds of targets it can hit, so out of the 7 different types of cards in Magic, it can hit as many of those as possible, and increases the difficulty of a card being played again, so it removes it to like your graveyard, your library, or exile is really what you're looking for. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for today. If you want to hit me up on Twitter, I am on there every so often. I just try and keep active and respond to people, post some new stuff. So CQ Crunch is my handle on Twitter. Again, please like, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you're able, and I will keep making these videos on a weekly basis so that we can keep moving forward. All right, guys, have a good one.